The smell of my garage is usually oil and rust, but one day it was the coppery tang of something impossible. A living heart, beating inside a machine that hadn't run in 40 years. The smell of my garage is the smell of my life. It's a holy trinity of scents. Petrichor from the damp concrete floor, the sharp tang of WD-40, and the rich, almost sweet perfume of ancient motor oil that seeped into the very wooden bones of the rafters. I inherited this place from my granddad, and some days I feel like I inherited his ghost too. He's in the worn grip of his favorite wrench, in the coffee stains on his workbench, in the way I talk to stubborn engines like they're misbehaving children. For me, restoring old machinery isn't just a job, it's a form of resurrection. Taking a rusted-out husk that's been forgotten by time and coaxing its iron soul back to life. Well, there's nothing else like it. So when the flatbed truck rumbled up my gravel driveway, carrying what looked less like a tractor and more like a tetanus trap, I felt that familiar thrill. It was a 1958 Massey Ferguson 35, or at least it had been one in a past life. The iconic red paint was peeling away in leprous sheets, revealing a body of pure, angry rust. Its tires were cracked and flat, sinking into the truck bed like deflated lungs. The man who climbed out of the cab matched the machine. He was old, with skin like tanned leather, and eyes that seemed to hold a century of secrets. He introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy. "She's been sitting in my family's barn since my father passed," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Hasn't turned over in 40 years. "That's quite a while," I said, circling the mechanical corpse. "Engine's probably seized solid. Might need a full teardown and rebuild. It'll be costly." He just nodded, his gaze fixed on the tractor. There was a strange intensity there, an emotion I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was something heavier. "Money isn't the object," he stated flatly. "I want it to run like it did the day it was made, exactly like it was." He pulled a thick wad of cash from his coat pocket, peeling off several $100 bills. "This is for the deposit. I'll pay the rest when it's done. No receipt necessary." That was the first red flag. In my business, everyone wants a receipt, but I'm not one to turn down a challenge or a cash payment. We unloaded the beast, and with a final, lingering look at the tractor, Mr. Abernathy drove off without another word, leaving me with the ghost of a machine and a pocketful of questions. The first week was a war. Every bolt was a battle, every nut a sworn enemy. Rust had fused metal to metal, creating a single, stubborn organism that refused to be disassembled. I went through 3 cans of penetrating oil and a dozen grinder wheels just getting the main body panels off. The engine was, as I suspected, a solid block of corrosion. The pistons were welded to the cylinder walls by decades of moisture and neglect. It was the kind of project that would make most mechanics walk away, but for me, it was a puzzle I was desperate to solve. It was during the second week, while I was wrestling with the seat assembly, that I found it. The seat was mounted on a thick steel plate, bolted directly to the tractor's transmission housing. Standard stuff. But one of the bolts, a massive half-inch brute, wouldn't budge. I put all my weight on a 4-foot breaker bar, my knuckles white, my muscles screaming. With a sound like a gunshot, the bolt head sheared clean off. The sudden release of tension sent my elbow slamming back into the plate beneath the seat. Instead of the solid, ringing clang, I expected I heard a dull, hollow thunk. I froze, sweat dripping into my eyes. That wasn't right. That whole section of the chassis should be solid cast iron. I tapped it again with the handle of my hammer. Thunk, thunk, thunk. It was unmistakable. There was a void in there. My curiosity, now fully ignited, took over. I grabbed a wire brush and started scrubbing away decades of grease and grime from the plate. And that's when I saw it. It wasn't a single plate. It was 2 plates, with a hairline seam running around the perimeter, so perfectly flush and caked with dirt that it was practically invisible. This wasn't a factory design. This was a modification. A secret. My mind raced. What would someone hide in an old farm tractor? Moonshine. Guns from a forgotten war. A stash of money. The thought sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I spent the next hour carefully, meticulously, working on the hidden compartment. The seam had been sealed with a thin line of brazing, disguised to look like a casting mark. It was masterful work. Whoever did this was a true craftsman. Using a delicate cutting wheel on my angle grinder, I began to carefully grind away the seal. The air filled with the smell of ozone and hot metal. Sparks showered the concrete floor, lighting up the dim corners of the garage. Finally, with a soft click, the seal broke. The panel was heavier than I expected. Using the tips of my fingers, I carefully lifted it. It came away with a faint hiss, like a vacuum being broken. The air that escaped was cold and sterile, smelling faintly of antiseptic and something else, something metallic and organic, like the coppery scent of blood. I grabbed my high-intensity LED flashlight and aimed the beam into the dark cavity. My first thought was that I was looking at some kind of bizarre, custom-built battery. It was a stainless steel box, about the size of a shoebox, nestled in a bed of what looked like hardened foam insulation. A series of thin, clear tubes filled with a dark, ruby-red fluid snaked out from the box, connecting to a small, intricate manifold of valves and what looked like tiny pumps. A thick, shielded cable ran from the box deeper into the tractor's chassis, disappearing towards the engine block. This was beyond anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't a moonshiner's stash or a gangster's hoard. It was something else entirely, something clinical, scientific. With trembling hands, I reached in and touched the box. It was cool to the touch and humming with a barely perceptible vibration. There was a latch on the front, a simple clasp that looked almost out of place on such a complex device. I hesitated for only a second before flipping it open. The lid lifted smoothly on silent hinges. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness inside, and my breath caught in my throat. I felt my blood run cold. Floating in the center of the box, suspended in a clear, viscous gel, was a heart. It wasn't a model. It wasn't a replica. It was real. I could see the dark muscle tissue, the delicate web of veins and arteries, the pale yellow of the fatty deposits. It was impossibly, terrifyingly real. Wires, finer than hairs, were pierced through the muscle at precise points, leading to a small circuit board at the bottom of the container that glowed with a faint, pulsing green light. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the image that burned itself onto the back of my eyelids. The worst part was that it was beating, a slow, steady, deliberate rhythm. Thump, 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 thump. The muscle contracted and relaxed in perfect, horrifying synchronicity, pumping the dark fluid through the attached tubes. I felt a wave of nausea and vertigo wash over me. I wanted to slam the lid shut, weld the panel back in place, and pretend I'd never seen it, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, my mind screaming, trying to process the impossible sight before me. Who would do this? Why? What was this thing? I leaned in closer, the beam of my flashlight shaking in my unsteady hand. I had to be dreaming. This had to be some kind of elaborate prank, a hyper-realistic prop. But my mechanic's eye saw the truth in the details, the seamless connection of the tubes, the microscopic precision of the wiring, the undeniable living movement of the cardiac muscle. And then, the impossible happened. As the focused beam of my light played across the surface of the organ, something changed. The slow, steady rhythm faltered. For a terrifying second, it stopped completely, and then it started again, faster this time. Thump, 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 thump. The pulses of green light on the circuit board below it began to flash more rapidly. It wasn't just beating. As my light hit it, the rhythm quickened. It was beating faster. It knew I had found it. I slammed the lid shut. The metallic click echoed in the sudden deafening silence of the garage. I scrambled backwards, tripping over a discarded air filter and landing hard on the concrete floor. My flashlight rolled away, its beam dancing crazily across the oil-stained ceiling. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, trying to match the impossible rhythm I had just witnessed. I lay there, gasping for air, the smell of dust and cold metal filling my lungs. My mind was a car engine redlining, pistons of thought firing without sense or sequence. A heart, a living, beating, human heart, in a box, in a 40-year dead tractor. It was a hallucination. That had to be it. I'd been working too hard, inhaling too many fumes from the rust remover. My granddad always warned me about that. Ventilate, boy, or the chemicals will start telling you stories. This was just a particularly vivid story. I pushed myself up, my hands shaking so badly I could barely make a fist. I walked over to the workbench, grabbed a grimy rag, and splashed cold water on my face from the utility sink. The shock of the cold was grounding. I looked at my reflection in a shard of broken mirror I had propped up on a shelf. My face was pale, my eyes wide with a look I'd never seen on myself before. Primal fear. "Get a grip, man," I muttered to my reflection. "It's a prop. Some kind of weird art project. A joke." But it wasn't a joke. Jokes don't have that smell, that sterile, coppery tang of life. Jokes don't vibrate with a low, persistent hum. And jokes don't react to you. I couldn't leave it. I couldn't just weld the panel back on and pretend this afternoon never happened. That box was a question that would burrow into my brain and rot me from the inside out. I was a mechanic. I take things apart to see how they work. This was the ultimate engine. With a deep breath that did little to calm me, I walked back to the tractor. My legs felt like lead. I picked up my flashlight, the aluminum body now feeling slick with sweat, and approached the open compartment like it was a viper's nest. I hesitated, then forced myself to lift the lid again. It was still there, still beating. Thump, 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 thump. The rhythm was back to its slow, resting state. I watched it for a full minute, mesmerized and repulsed. The sheer biological reality of it was overwhelming, but this time I forced my fear down and let my mechanic's brain take over. Analyze the system. Understand the components. I shined the light on the box itself. No serial numbers, no brand names, no markings of any kind. The stainless steel was medical grade, seamlessly welded. The clear tubes were filled with that dark fluid, which I now realized was some kind of synthetic, oxygenated blood. They fed into the manifold, which had tiny, almost silent pumps whirring away, circulating the fluid. It was a self-contained perpetual life support machine. My eyes followed the thick, shielded cable that snaked out of the box and disappeared into the tractor's frame. Where did it go? What was it powering? Or what was powering it? I had to know. The engine rebuild could wait. This was the only job that mattered now. Getting to the cable was a nightmare. It was routed through the densest, most inaccessible parts of the chassis. I had to remove the fuel tank, a heavy, sludge-filled monstrosity that fought me every step of the way. Then I had to unbolt the hydraulic lift arms. Hours passed. The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the garage. The only sounds were the scrape of my wrenches and the impossibly soft rhythmic beat from the open compartment behind me. I felt like a surgeon performing an autopsy on a creature from another world. Finally, I exposed the cable's path. It ran alongside the main transmission housing before splitting. A thick bundle of wires branched off and went straight into the engine block, terminating right next to the number 2 cylinder. I couldn't see the exact connection point without tearing the engine down completely, but the placement was deliberate. And weird. Another smaller branch snaked up towards the driver's console. I followed it, my hands covered in a half-century of grime, and found it connected to the back of the instrument panel, specifically to the oil pressure and temperature gauges. The final branch of the cable was the one that made the hairs on my arms stand up. It went directly to the ignition coil. I just stood there, staring at the connection. None of it made sense. Why would a life support system for a disembodied heart need to be wired into the tractor's ignition and gauges? You don't connect a pacemaker to a spark plug. It was a closed loop. The box was keeping the heart alive, but the heart was somehow integrated into the very nervous system of the machine. Mr. Abernathy's words came back to me. I wanted to run like it did the day it was made, exactly like it was. He knew. He had to have known this was in here. This wasn't just a restoration job. It was a reanimation. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Who was his father? Not just a farmer. No farmer built this. This was the work of a genius. A terrifying, brilliant, and utterly mad genius. My mind was spinning with impossible theories. Was this some kind of biological battery? An organic computer? Was the heart the tractor's soul? I felt a frantic, reckless urge to find out. The engine was seized solid, the pistons frozen in their cylinders. The battery was a corroded paperweight. Trying to start it conventionally was impossible, but the heart was alive. The device was humming. There was power in the system. I grabbed a 12-volt test light and a set of jumper wires. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady, possessed by a dangerous, all-consuming curiosity. I clipped one end of a jumper cable to the positive terminal of the ignition coil. The other end I held in my hand, the copper alligator clip glinting under the single bare bulb hanging from the rafters. I was bypassing everything, the key, the starter solenoid, all the dead and rusted components. I was going to send a signal directly down the wire that led to that thing. I took one last look at the open box. The heart beat its slow, steady rhythm in the clear gel. Thump, 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 thump. A metronome counting down to... what? I closed my eyes and touched the jumper clip to the battery post. There was no spark, no sound from the engine. Nothing. I felt a surge of disappointment, almost relief. Of course, it didn't do anything. It was a crazy idea. But then I heard it. The rhythm from the box faltered. I opened my eyes and looked. The heart had stopped its steady beat. It gave a single, violent convulsion, a full-body shudder that sloshed the gel in its container. The little green light on the circuit board flashed bright and urgent. Then, behind me, from the tractor's dashboard, came a sound. A soft, mechanical click. My head snapped up. I stared at the instrument panel, at the row of dead, faded gauges. They were coated in a thick layer of dust, their needles resting on zero, where they had been for 40 years. But one of them wasn't on zero anymore. The needle on the oil pressure gauge, the one I had just traced the wire to, was twitching. As I watched, it slowly, impossibly began to climb. It trembled past 10 psi, then 20. The needle wasn't just moving. It was sweeping upwards, smooth and steady, as if the engine was running, building pressure, waking from a 4-decade slumber. The needle on the oil pressure gauge kept climbing. A silent, impossible accusation against everything I knew about mechanics. A dead engine doesn't build oil pressure. A seized engine doesn't have a pulse. My own pulse was hammering in my ears, a frantic counterpoint to the silence in the garage. I stared at the gauge, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. The needle reached 40 psi, the normal operating pressure for a healthy Massey Ferguson engine, and held there, steady as a rock. I dropped the jumper cable as if it were red hot. The moment the metal clip clattered against the concrete floor, the gauge needle shivered and began its slow, deliberate descent back to zero. I glanced back at the open compartment. The heart, which had been still and convulsed, gave another shudder and then resumed its slow, metronomic beat. Thump, 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 thump. The system had reset. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, caught between the two impossible phenomena, the living heart in the box and the ghost of pressure in the engine's veins. It wasn't just a power source, it was a symbiotic relationship. The heart wasn't just in the tractor, it was the tractor. The gauges weren't reading engine metrics, they were reading vital signs. The oil pressure gauge, it wasn't measuring oil, it was measuring blood pressure. My legs felt weak. I stumbled over to my workbench and sank onto the rickety stool, my head in my hands. The familiar, comforting sense of my garage now seemed alien and menacing. This place, my sanctuary, had been invaded by something that defied all logic, all laws of physics and biology. Grandad had taught me that every machine has a soul, but I always thought he was being poetic. What if he was being literal? Who was Mr. Abernathy's father? What kind of man builds a machine like this? Was he a doctor, a bioengineer, a madman who blurred the line between flesh and steel? And the most terrifying question of all, the one that coiled in the pit of my stomach like a cold snake. Whose heart was it? Sleep was out of the question. The image of that beating heart was seared into my brain. I spent the next few hours pacing the garage, running through every possible explanation. Advanced robotics? Some kind of biomimetic pump? But no pump looks that perfect, that organic. No machine bleeds. I kept coming back to the same horrifying conclusion. It was real. As the first hints of dawn began to soften the edges of the night, I made a decision. I couldn't continue working on the tractor. Not like this. I couldn't just put a new set of piston rings into an engine that was somehow alive. I had to know more. Mr. Abernathy was my only lead. The problem was he'd paid in cash and I hadn't thought to get a phone number or an address. No receipt necessary, he'd said. He didn't want a paper trail, but he'd driven a distinctive, slightly battered late 90s Ford F-250, dark green, with a dent in the passenger side door. Not much to go on, but in a small community like mine, it was a start. I locked up the garage, leaving the compartment open. I couldn't bring myself to close the lid again, to hide that impossible, rhythmic life away in the dark. It felt wrong, like closing a coffin on someone who was still breathing. I drove into town, my mind a chaotic mess. I went to the diner, the place where all local news and gossip is brewed stronger than the coffee. I described the truck and Mr. Abernathy to Martha, the waitress who'd been serving scrambled eggs and rumors since I was in diapers. Her face lit up with recognition. "Oh, you mean Elias Abernathy? Sure, doesn't come to town much. Lives way out past Miller's Ridge. Old family farm. Been in his family for generations. Strange folk, the Abernathys. Keep to themselves mostly." She gave me rough directions, her voice laced with the casual curiosity of someone who senses a story brewing. The drive out to the Abernathy farm took me down roads that slowly dissolved from pavement to gravel, to little more than a pair of dirt ruts. The landscape grew wilder, the trees thicker. It felt like I was driving back in time. Finally, I saw it. A weathered, two-story farmhouse, its white paint peeling like birch bark, and a massive, ancient barn that looked like it was being held up by sheer force of will. The green F-250 was parked near the house. I parked my own truck and walked up to the porch, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air was still and heavy. Before I could knock, the front door creaked open. Mr. Abernathy stood there, framed in the doorway. He wasn't surprised to see me. His ancient eyes seemed to look right through me, and a slow, sad smile touched his lips. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said, his voice the same low rumble. "You found it, didn't you?" I could only nod, my throat suddenly dry. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "There are things you need to understand." The inside of the house was like a museum. Dark wood, antique furniture covered in dusty sheets, and the faint, sweet smell of decay. He led me into a study lined with books, not farming manuals but textbooks. Anatomy, mechanical engineering, cybernetics, early theoretical physics. On a large oak desk, under a glass dome, was a tarnished brass plaque. It was a university award from 1955, given to a Dr. Alistair Abernathy for visionary contributions in the field of biomechanical integration. My father was a brilliant man, Elias said, his gaze distant. He worked for the government back during the Cold War. Top-secret projects. They were trying to build the perfect soldier, something that could survive anything. They were experimenting with merging man and machine, but their methods were crude, inhuman. My father saw the potential, but he couldn't stomach the cruelty. So he left. He came back here, to the farm, to continue his work in private. He believed he could create a true synthesis. Not a man in a machine, or a machine in a man, but a single, symbiotic organism. He paused, picking up a faded photograph from the desk. It showed a younger, sharper version of himself standing next to a smiling man with wild, intelligent eyes, Dr. Alistair Abernathy, and between them stood a young boy, no older than 10, with a bright, curious smile. "That's my brother," Elias said softly. "Daniel." A cold dread washed over me. I think, on some level, I already knew what he was going to say next. "Daniel was born with a bad heart," he continued, his voice thick with an ancient grief. "A congenital defect. The doctors in those days gave him a year, maybe 2. My father couldn't accept that. He used all his knowledge, all his forbidden research, to build something that could save him. A permanent, self-sustaining vessel. An iron body to house a failing heart." He looked at me, his eyes pleading for me to understand. He wasn't just building a tractor, you see. He was building an ark. He perfected the system. The heart suspended in a nutrient gel, powered by a small thermoelectric generator that drew heat from the engine block. In return, the heart acted as a central processing unit. It regulated the machine's systems. The oil pressure gauge monitored its blood pressure, the temperature gauge its core temp. He finished it in the spring of 1958. It was a miracle. The heart was stable. Daniel, he was going to live. My mind was reeling. Daniel. The heart in the tractor belonged to a little boy. What happened to him?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Elias's face crumpled. "There was an accident, before the final transfer could be made. A stupid, senseless farm accident. Daniel, he was gone. We lost him." He took a shaky breath. "My father was destroyed. He had this perfect vessel, this miracle of science he'd built to save his son, and his son was gone. But the heart, he couldn't bring himself to let go of the heart. It was the only part of Daniel he had left. So he finished the project. He sealed his son's heart inside the machine he had built for him. He started it up once, just to see it run, and then he parked it in the barn and never touched it again. It was his son's coffin, his monument. The silence that followed was heavier than any machine I'd ever lifted. The story was so monstrous, so filled with grief and mad love, that I couldn't process it. For 40 years that heart has been beating alone in the dark, Elias said, his voice cracking. My father passed away. I grew old. But Daniel, he's still in there. When I brought you the tractor, I just wanted to hear the engine run again. I wanted him to live just once more, the way my father intended. That's all. I finally understood the weight I'd seen in his eyes, the desperate need to have it running exactly like it was. He wasn't restoring a machine. He was trying to resurrect his brother. I drove back to my garage in a daze, the world seeming thin and unreal. When I got back, I didn't reach for a wrench. I reached for the thickest, cleanest electrical wire I had. I understood now. The system needed a charge to fully initialize, to bridge the gap between the biological and the mechanical. The jumper cable had been too crude a jolt. It needed a clean, steady connection. With a surgeon's precision, I wired a new, fully charged battery directly into the ignition circuit I had traced earlier. I checked the connections twice. Everything was perfect. This was it. I was going to turn the key. I was going to wake Daniel up. I stood by the side of the tractor, my hand on the cold, rusty ignition key. I took a deep breath and turned it. There was no sound of a starter motor, just a series of soft, rapid clicks from deep within the machine. Then a low hum started, the same hum from the heart's container, but now it was resonating through the entire frame of the tractor. I looked at the instrument panel. The oil pressure and temperature gauges both swept to life, their needles rising and holding steady. And then I heard a new sound. It wasn't the sound of an engine turning over. It was a slow, deep, rhythmic inhalation, a sound like a giant pair of iron lungs drawing their first breath in 4 decades. Shh-ka. The entire chassis seemed to expand, to flex around me. The pistons, which I knew for a fact were seized solid with rust, began to move. Not with the explosive violence of combustion, but with a smooth, silent, inexorable force. One of the rear wheels, caked with hardened mud, gave a sickening crack as it began to turn, inch by agonizing inch, under a power that came not from gasoline, but from the steady, rhythmic beat of a little boy's heart. The garage was filled with a resonant hum that vibrated through the soles of my boots and up into my teeth. It was the sound of life, but a life unlike any I had ever known. The massive rear wheel turned, not with the jerky power of an engine, but with the fluid, deliberate strength of a muscle. The caked mud and rust on the axle groaned and fractured, falling to the concrete floor like shattered pottery. I watched, breathless as the machine, the organism pushed itself through a cycle of reanimation. The pistons slid up and down in their cylinders with a silence that was more terrifying than any roar, lubricated not by motor oil, but by some internal alchemy I couldn't begin to comprehend. This wasn't a repair job anymore. It was a séance. I was a bystander at the resurrection of Daniel Abernathy. The hum intensified, and the lights on the small circuit board inside the heart's chamber pulsed in time with the tractor's slow, breathing rhythm. It was a feedback loop. The heart was powering the machine, and the machine's movement was somehow nourishing the heart. Dr. Abernathy hadn't just built a life support system. He had created a new form of existence, a perfect, self-sustaining union of flesh and steel. I backed away slowly, my toolbox and wrenches seeming like primitive artifacts in the presence of this biomechanical marvel. What had I done? Elias had just wanted to hear the engine run, but this was something else entirely. The tractor wasn't just running, it was waking up. For nearly an hour I watched it. The wheels turned slowly, the hydraulic arms twitched and lifted a few inches before settling back down. The headlights, their glass cracked and yellowed, flickered with a soft pale light, like sleepy eyes opening after a long slumber. There was an intelligence to its movements, a sense of it testing its own limbs, relearning the boundaries of its iron body. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me out of my trance. It was Elias. "Did it work?" he asked, his voice tight with a lifetime of anticipation. "Mr. Abernathy," I said, struggling to find the words. "You need to get here. Now, it's more than you think." The wait for him to arrive was the longest 20 minutes of my life. The tractor had settled into a low, steady idle, the hum a constant presence in the garage. The wheels had stopped turning, but I had the distinct feeling that it was resting, not dormant. It was aware. When Elias's old green truck rumbled up the driveway, the tractor's headlights flickered again, brighter this time, as if in recognition. Elias practically ran from his truck, his old face a mask of hope and fear. He stopped dead in the doorway of the garage, his eyes wide. He saw what I saw, not a restored piece of farm equipment, but a living, breathing entity. "Daniel," he whispered, the name a fragile prayer in the humming air. He walked towards it, slow and hesitant, like a man approaching a ghost. He reached out a trembling, age-spotted hand and laid it on the rusty red fender. The moment his skin made contact, the low hum of the machine deepened, the rhythm of its internal pulse quickening slightly. It knew him. Tears streamed down Elias's weathered cheeks. He wasn't seeing a tractor. He was seeing his long-lost brother. "He's in there," he sobbed, turning to me. "I can feel him. It's really him." We stood there for a long time, two men bearing witness to a miracle born of grief and genius. The ethical nightmare of it, all the disembodied heart, the boy trapped in a machine was eclipsed by the sheer, undeniable reality of the reunion. An old man was touching his brother for the first time in over 60 years. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice hushed. Elias wiped his eyes on his sleeve, a look of profound peace settling over his features. "We let him live," he said simply. "My father built him a body that would never age, never fail. He gave him immortality. We just let him be." Over the next few days, the three of us, me, Elias, and Daniel, found a new routine. Elias would come every morning, and we would simply sit in the garage. He'd talk to the tractor, telling it stories of their childhood, of the parents it never got to know, of the world that had changed so much while it slept, and Daniel would listen. The hum of his engine would change in pitch and rhythm. The gauges would flicker in response to Elias's voice. It was a conversation, as real and meaningful as any I had ever heard. I did eventually finish the cosmetic restoration. It felt like the right thing to do. I carefully sanded down the rusted panels, primed them, and gave them a fresh coat of the iconic Massey Ferguson red. I replaced the cracked tires and polished the clouded glass of the gauges. It seemed only fitting that if Daniel was going to live in this body, it should be a dignified one. As I worked, I felt a strange connection to the machine. I'd talk to it, same as Elias. "All right, Daniel, let's get this new alternator bracket on you." And the machine would hum in response, the oil pressure needle giving a little bounce of acknowledgement. When it was all done, the tractor looked brand new, a gleaming scarlet jewel sitting in the center of my garage. But its beauty was no longer just mechanical. It was biological. It had a presence, a soul that was palpable. The day came when Elias decided it was time. He shouldn't be cooped up in a garage, he said, his eyes on the open bay door and the green fields beyond. He was meant to be on the farm. We didn't need a flatbed to move him this time. I opened the garage door and Elias climbed into the driver's seat. He didn't turn a key or press a starter. He just placed his hands on the controls and spoke softly. "It's time to go home, Danny." With a hum that swelled into a low, powerful thrum, the tractor rolled forward under its own silent power. It moved out of the garage and into the sunlight for the first time in over 40 years. It didn't leave a trail of exhaust, just the scent of ozone and warm earth. Elias drove it slowly down my gravel driveway and onto the dirt road, heading back towards the Abernathy farm. I watched them go, the bright red machine and the old man, until they were just a speck in the distance. I was left standing in the silence of my garage, a place that suddenly felt profoundly empty. I never saw the tractor again, but Elias would call me sometimes. He'd tell me how Daniel was doing. He'd park him in the old barn at night, but during the day he'd let him roam the fields. He said the tractor would sometimes just sit on the crest of a hill for hours, silent and still, as if watching the clouds. He was finally living the life his father had intended for him, a quiet, peaceful existence in the heart of the land he was born on. My life went back to normal, or as normal as it could be. I still fix engines, I still smell of oil and steel, but something inside me has changed. Sometimes, late at night when the garage is quiet, I'll be working on a stubborn engine, and I'll put my hand on the cold engine block. For a split second, I'll imagine I can feel a faint, steady pulse beneath the iron, and I'll remember the secret that sleeps in a barn out past Miller's Ridge, the secret of a boy named Daniel, whose heart beats not in a chest of bone and flesh, but in a body of pure American steel. Granddad was right. Every machine has a soul. I just happened to find one that was still beating.